working. Okay. Make sure I've got everything that I need. Do that. All right. So yeah, this talk is kind of, I'm hoping to keep it to half an hour max. And I'm going to try and sort of explore a number of kind of different things reasonably briefly, I guess, as kind of an overview, and then hopefully have a little bit of discussion and conversation at the end. And I'm happy to obviously answer questions that you guys might have. So my background really is in the US Supreme Court and, you know, how it operates. And my PhD particularly focused kind of on the 60s and 70s and some of the key decisions in that period. So obviously Roe v. Wade is something I'm reasonably familiar with. I also have found that, you know, being an expert in the US Supreme Court is a relative rarity in New Zealand. And so that's kind of led to some of the media work I've done as well. And I've tried to kind of stay abreast of things as they've developed in the US, particularly in this space, but also a couple of other kind of interesting kind of ongoing controversies in the US. But this is really the big one at the moment, I think, and is going to continue to be for the foreseeable future. So with that in mind, this is kind of a rough structure of what I want to talk about today. So I'm going to start with the kind of key cases from a little bit earlier. So Roe v. Wade, obviously, and then Casey, which for me are the two kind of really key, crucial Supreme Court decisions in this area. I'm then going to talk through the decision this year in Dobbs briefly, and talk a little bit about that in the context of kind of legal and constitutional issues rather than the kind of more social side of things, and look a little bit at what's happened since Dobbs, and a little bit of speculation with my kind of future gazing hat on about what might happen in the future, and hopefully kind of cast a little bit of context, I guess, around what I think might happen. And then, yeah, we'll have some questions and discussion, hopefully. So, sorry, I'm just going to get rid of that window. I can put that over there, actually. Sorry, it's too many screens and zooming and everything. Okay, so we'll start with Roe v. Wade. So obviously 1973 decision written by Harry Blackman, whose picture is up there. And Roe v. Wade's a really interesting one because I think fundamentally as a decision based on principle and, you know, doing the right thing, if that was what we judged a constitutional court on, then I think Roe v. Wade very much ticks a lot of boxes. It's a really good decision in principle for me. In constitutional terms, it's actually not the best decision. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But the quote I've got up there is from the majority opinion. And this kind of, you know, hopefully captures the essence of the decision. So it's based on an idea of a right to privacy. And then Blackman says whether that's found in the 14th Amendment, concept of personal liberty, which is also a little bit vague, or whether it's in the 9th Amendment, or whether it's somewhere else. At some point, there's a mention of the 5th Amendment as well. And so wherever you find this right of privacy, it's broad enough that encompasses a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. And so to me, and to a lot of scholars that have commented on this, it's really vague. And it's vague in a constitutional sense because it doesn't really give a clear grounding for where you're locating this right to abortion. And that's one of the reasons why it comes in for quite a bit of criticism. And it comes in for criticism not just from kind of conservative anti-abortion groups, but also from quite a number of kind of liberal legal scholars who say, well, yeah, we agree with the decision, but it's really badly kind of conceptualized. It doesn't make that much sense in a constitutional aspect. And so that, I think, is quite interesting. And so it sets up this kind of trimester-based test where basically you can't restrict abortion in the first trimester. There's some limited scope for regulation in the second, and you can kind of do any sort of regulation you like in the third. So there's still a little bit of difference in what the states do and what they're capable of doing. You get slightly different sets of rules in different states, but the kind of broad principle that applies to everyone is that there's no restriction on abortion in the first trimester in particular, and limited restrictions in the second. The interesting thing, I think, for me with Roe v. Wade, this is like my favorite ever graph about the Supreme Court. It's really fun, and we could spend hours talking about it in all sorts of contexts. But I've put a line there, and I'm sort of highlighting it with the pointer, which shows you the yellow line that's kind of tracking through here is the Supreme Court's kind of median point, so the median justice. So you can see that the Supreme Court in 1973 is actually leaning a little bit conservative, the overall kind of makeup of the court. And so the Roe v. Wade decision is actually really interesting because it's a decision that you would think would be much more likely to happen kind of here, where the Supreme Court actually had a liberal tilt. But instead it comes here, and the context of that, I think is actually something interesting because it's not, at the time it's made, it's not this kind of explicit liberal versus conservative divide where the courts split purely down ideological lines like it is now, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So here you see actually in the 7-2, my next, so in the 7-2, so Roe's a 7-2 split, and in the 7 justices in the majority, there are actually 5 who are appointed by Republican presidents and who have some kind of conservative lean in some respect, right? So the Chief Justice Warren Burger, who's up here, who's at that point kind of the second most ideologically conservative justice on the court, is part of that majority. Blackmun, who writes the opinion, is kind of here. So you actually see that the Roe decision is grounded in some fairly conservative justices, and it has 5 Republican appointed justices in that majority. So there's not that same ideological split that we see now. Partly, I think, because some of these justices are just better judges than what we've got now. But also, it wasn't necessarily seen, I think, in 73 in the same kind of stark ideological terms that the debate kind of is seen now in the US. And I think that's kind of worth remembering because I think it's quite important. And we'll see a little bit more of that later. So kind of jumping forward a little bit, obviously the decision in Roe v. Wade was, relatively controversial, came in for a lot of criticism, particularly from conservative groups, and a number of states, particularly in the South, kind of repeatedly, every now and then they pass laws to challenge it, kind of seeking to get the Supreme Court to take on this issue again, and see what might be done, see if the Supreme Court will kind of walk back on itself a little bit. And so Casey, this decision in 1992, is kind of the Supreme Court's second go at dealing with the abortion issue. And I actually think that they do a much better job here. And so really what Casey did is it gave them the opportunity to kind of confront what they'd done in Roe v. Wade and say, well, okay, let's look at this again, see how this is stacking up. Maybe take on board some of the criticism of the Roe decision as being quite vague, and let's see what comes out of it. It's interesting, I think, because if I go back to this slide, again, here in the early 90s, the court's quite conservative, although it does have this kind of block of justices who are ideologically conservative, but only just. And so on different issues, they kind of flip different ways, which is important for what happens in Casey. And so actually, there is some interesting research around Casey that suggests that the court came really, really close to overruling Roe v. Wade here. It's a conservative majority on the court. There's a lot of criticism of Roe v. Wade. And there are kind of internal court documents that suggest that at one point they had 5 votes to overrule. And then a couple of them backed down, or at least one of them backed down. And what they ended up with is basically the court split 3 ways. So there's one group of justices who want to overrule Roe v. Wade, who end up dissenting, and they're in a minority. There's a group of justices who would kind of keep Roe v. Wade and almost strengthen it. And then you've got this kind of plurality in the middle, made up of O'Connor, Kennedy, and Souter, who kind of revisit the grounds that Roe v. Wade was decided on, and they effectively make a better case for constitutionalizing the protection of abortion. So they say explicitly that the constitutional protection of abortion rights comes from the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. So it's much more explicit, and it's grounded in kind of better constitutional law. By this point, there's a little bit more of the Supreme Court's own work on the 14th Amendment that's relevant. And so they kind of draw some of those principles in. And it's a much more grounded, I think, legally grounded test, a much better decision in terms of its kind of constitutional makeup. And it's very clear, right, that this is, this is where you find this right. It exists. We're maintaining this precedent that Roe has set, and they're very strongly, that plurality are very strong on the fact that the court has now set this precedent. It would take a lot, and it should take a lot, for the court to ever walk back on a precedent once it's made a decision like this. And they say that that situation simply doesn't exist in 1992. So we'll stick with that precedent, kind of clear up some of that ambiguity. They abandon that sort of trimester-based test and kind of substitute a like a viability test, which tweaks things slightly, but in essence, the ruling's maintained. It's kind of, for me, it's strengthened because it has a stronger legal grounding. And so when it comes to Dobbs this year, I think the better thing to look back on is actually the Casey decision, because I think it's the kind of stronger precedent-based, but also constitutional basis for abortion. It's quite a good decision, and it's well grounded in the law. So kind of jumping forward again in time, I think we can't really talk about Dobbs without talking about what happened to the court in the sort of 4 or 5 years before Dobbs. And so Trump gets a little bit lucky, and also you could argue the Republican Party behaves really badly to give Trump 3 Supreme Court nominations and effectively to completely reshape the composition of the current court. And so Scalia, who is a staunch conservative, ultimately is replaced by Neil Gorsuch, which doesn't really change the ideological makeup of the court because they're both very conservative. But the thing of note there is that Scalia actually died about 8 months before the election while Obama was still in power. Obama should have had the chance to replace Scalia with his own choice, but at that point, the Republican Party controlled the Senate, and they blocked any consideration of Obama's appointment and left the Supreme Court with only 8 justices for a period of 8 or 9 months, on the grounds that close to an election, that pick should be held for the incoming president who has kind of an elected mandate. It's really a load of crap, excuse my language, but that's how they frame it. So then Trump wins the election and he gets to make that pick. Justice Kennedy then retires, replaced by Brett Kavanaugh, another kind of rightward swing. And then really disappointingly, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died and was replaced by Amy Coney Barrett. So that's a major rightward swing, particularly in the Ginsburg case. And here you kind of see the hypocrisy of the Republican Party, because Ginsburg died really much closer to an election than Scalia did. So applying the same kind of logic, that pick should have been held over, but instead the Republican Party, because they controlled the Senate, were able to push through that nomination in sort of just under a month before the election. And really that changed the shape of the court. And in particular, it limited the influence of the Chief Justice, who, until Ginsburg died, Chief Justice Roberts was the swing vote on the court. He was kind of the center of the court. And while he's, a super conservative himself and definitely opposed to abortion, he's much more, I think, aware of the court's position in society. And he's much more respectful of the court's past work, and a lot less activist than some of the current crop of conservatives. So this has a really big impact on what happens in Dobbs, because it gives the Supreme Court a really strong kind of anti-abortion conservative mandate and majority. So the new court, as we see it, is not at all diverse. So this, thinking about the court that decided Dobbs, 4 Harvard and 4 Yale graduates, Catholic dominated, which is obviously, although these things are very nuanced, not super good for abortion rights. There's kind of improvements on race and gender, which aren't really relevant, but I think the religious point is quite important. I've said 6.5 Catholics, which seems like a strange way to put it, but one of them is kind of brought up Catholic, but sort of has shifted since, but kind of still has that Catholic background. It's the first time there's been a Catholic majority on the Supreme Court. Historically, it's a Protestant-dominated institution. I think on average, for most of the court's history, there's sort of either one or two Catholic justices, certainly not a majority. And this, I think, also plays a role in shaping the direction the court goes in. So to Dobbs, and I guess what I should say with this, the way that Trump's packed the court and the kind of makeup of this court is a long-running Republican Party project, right? Almost ever since Roe v. Wade, they've been on a mission to appoint conservative justices who are opposed to abortion. It's been kind of part of their party platform. And in terms of like kind of raw politicking, they've been very successful at kind of getting their people into high places. And so when the Republican Party have been selecting Supreme Court justices, one of the things that they're actively looking for is opposition to abortion. So this is not like some sort of accident. It's a long-running and quite dedicated project to put justices on the court who will challenge Roe v. Wade. It hasn't always worked out. Some of the people that they've put on the court have, ended up defending it. Roberts himself at some points has defended the precedent set in Roe v. Wade. But ultimately, this is kind of a 30-year, 40-year project to get a court that would do what they wanted and overturn Roe v. Wade. And so Trump kind of finally was able to manage that with this court. So to kind of briefly sum up some of the key points from Dobbs, so Samuel Alito wrote the opinion for the majority. My suspicion is that he's been probably waiting his whole judicial career to write this one opinion. It's something he's probably looked forward to, and it's quite grim reading. I don't know if anyone else has read the opinion. It's not good, and I say that for a number of reasons. I think for me, analysing it from a historical perspective as a historian, it engages in quite a lot of bad history. If he handed it in as a piece of work, I would mark it harshly. It's also, I think, bad law, right? It smacks of ideological preference kind of cast in a legal and historical framework, but drawing on legal and historical sources only where they suit the argument and ignoring the ones that don't suit what he wants to say. So it's very much picking and choosing, and it's, I would say, bad history and bad law. It's not particularly good. It also completely ignores women's rights. So there's no mention in Alito's opinion of the rights of women at all. And he has this very, he's what we call an originalist. So he has the view that the 14th Amendment's meaning is what it meant when it was adopted in 1868. So, the people who drafted that amendment in 1868, this is what they intended it to mean. Therefore, that's what we should interpret it as meaning. They didn't intend for it to include abortion, so therefore abortion is not included. That's problematic for a number of reasons. This originalist view is really problematic because it ignores, if you think about 1868 when it's adopted, women don't have the right to vote. So that's obviously really problematic because they're not having a say in the political process that's kind of dictating what's happening 140 or 150 years later. It also, to me, just makes kind of no logical sense that you would govern your country based on the views of a bunch of elite white men 150 years ago, but that's kind of beside the point, I guess. So his view, Alito's view, is that the Constitution makes no reference to abortion, that right's not implicitly protected. And he says, the decision in Roe v. Wade was egregiously bad when it was made. It remains egregiously bad. Therefore, we should overrule it. He likens his opinion here to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which overturned segregation, saying, hey, I'm doing this wonderful thing, just like the court did in Brown, which to me is actually quite offensive and just inherently flawed. We also then get Clarence Thomas, who's probably the most conservative justice on the court. And so Alito, in his opinion, is quite, he explicitly says that this decision only applies to abortion. We're not meaning to kind of cast any doubt on other decisions the court has made. Abortion for some reason for him is different to these other things. And so he's sort of careful to say we're not challenging that. Clarence Thomas comes out in a concurring opinion and says, well, actually, no, if we apply the same reasoning that we're using here to these other cases, we should also overturn all this other stuff. And so he would overturn, if it was up to him, cases like Griswold, Lawrence v. Texas, and Obergefell, which constitutionalized the right to contraception, homosexual activity, and same-sex marriage. And when you look at how those rights are conceived of, they're based on the same constitutional provisions and the same kind of discourse around privacy. And so when you cast doubt on Roe v. Wade and Casey, you do implicitly cast doubt on these other decisions. And that's one of the things that I think is particularly problematic about Dobbs. And Clarence Thomas is quite explicit in saying we should go back and overrule these as well, which I think is quite terrible. The part of the case that I think is most worth reading, and so if you're interested in this, you can go and read the dissenting opinion from Justice Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan. And it's very eloquent, and it's very well written, and it's very clear. It's kind of easily accessible to the average person, whereas a lot of Supreme Court decisions aren't. And so they talk about how this kind of decision will erase women's interests and recognises only the interests of the state. And so they make this really strong defence of women's rights, which I think is something that's really missing from Alito's analysis and is really important. They describe the decision as catastrophic, and they talk about how, logically taken, this would actually lead to the overall of all these other things. And then they also have a much stronger and better reading of the history of abortion rights in the US, which is much more nuanced and takes into account the actual scholarship, not Alito's kind of random ramblings. So yeah, the dissenting opinion is really good and it's really important, but it's only 3 justices, so it has a really limited impact at this point in time, with the court made up how it is. So the kind of final thing that I want to talk about is what happens next. And so we'll start with what's already happened since. And so this is Kansas, and I think this is interesting. And what I'm trying to do, I guess, I recognize that Dobbs is, for me, it's a disaster. And I know that it's a sentiment probably shared by lots of you, and it's shared by a lot of people in the States. And I don't in any way intend to kind of discount or want to discount how much of a disaster that is, but I'm trying to kind of pick out a few positives from the reaction, I guess, that's occurred. So Kansas is an interesting one because it's a solid red state, right? It's a conservative state that has a really strong background leaning conservative, voting conservative. So you can see the 2020 election, Trump won by a sort of 56-41 split. So it's a very firmly a red state. In their primary elections in August, Kansas actually asked whether, in a ballot measure, whether the Constitution should be amended to remove protection of abortion rights. And the vote split sort of 60-40 to say no, keep the protection of abortion rights in the Constitution. And so here we see on an individual state level that the reaction is not what necessarily I think the court would have expected. I think a lot of people expected that, the red states would all kind of do away with abortion protections. And to be fair, some of them have. But you can see here where public opinion is involved and where the public has the ability to have a say. The way that the public splits is quite different to how they split on political lines. So it's not a straight kind of conservative, Republican Democrat split. There are a lot of people on the right who still support the protection of abortion rights. And so I think this kind of gives us a way forward to some extent, and a little bit of a guide to what might happen next. The other really interesting thing is that the US have midterm elections coming up in November, and all of their House of Representatives, Congress comes up for re-election. And it's really hard to get a good idea of the polling for that. But the general consensus, at least until July, was that things were heading Republican, right? That it looked really likely that the Republican Party was going to take control of the House based on, the underperformance of the incumbent government. and a whole lot of other kind of economic issues. And so you can see how that public opinion tracks there. And so this is kind of an aggregate poll of, do you want Republicans or Democrats to represent you in Congress? And so you can see it's kind of tracking through here, April, May, June, a fairly solid Republican lead. The Dobbs decision happens and it splits, right? There's a complete reversal, and it's now leaning Democrat. And the polling here is really tricky. A lot of people, I think, are still expecting a Republican victory in the midterms, but it's definitely got a lot closer. In some estimates, it's kind of a 5 or 6% swing, which I think is really significant. And it's basically, as far as I can tell, and as far as most of the pollsters can tell, that swing is based almost exclusively on the Dobbs ruling and opposition to it. And people, to be quite frank, are pissed at the Republican Party, and their votes are reflecting that. We've also seen kind of at state level some of the way that this might play out in the future. So Indiana almost immediately passed a new law banning abortions, I think almost completely with very limited exceptions. It was in effect for a week before a state court judge suspended it, saying that the state constitution actually protects the right to abortion. Whether that decision will hold up in the long term is really unclear. It's only kind of a first instance decision. But it shows how, as well as being a federal constitutional issue, because the Supreme Court have kind of said that this is now the domain of states to regulate, the fight has shifted to like state Supreme Courts, to state legislatures, and to state kind of ballot measures. And so you can see that playing out here in Indiana. You can also see some kind of marked shifts in public opinion. So the Pew kind of aggregate poll here is quite long running. So you can just see, but you can see this kind of big jump here and big dip here that coincides with Dobbs. And here in Gallup's polling as well, the kind of pro-choice, pro-life split. And a lot of this comes down to people becoming more aware of the issue, and a lot of kind of resentment towards the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court's decision here, which broadly is seen as being politically motivated and not based on legal principle. So, post-Dobbs, there's a marked shift in public opinion as well. So that's what has happened. Putting my kind of prediction hat on, this is really challenging, but I can see Dobbs having a really significant impact on the midterm elections in November. I'm not sure it will be enough to keep the Democrats in power, but it's certainly become the issue in the midterms, and it's given the Democrats a lot of momentum. There's been a massive uptick in the registering of new voters, and the registering of new voters has drastically swung in favour of women voters. So women are registering to vote in massive numbers, which is really interesting, and that has the potential to really skew some of these elections in ways that the polls probably won't pick up. There are also 5 states that have ballot initiatives, so effectively referendums, largely citizen-initiated referendums that will come up at the same time in November. And those are, framed in different ways. So California would enshrine abortion rights. Kentucky would say definitely no protection. And then, you can see the others up there, Michigan enshrining constitutional protections. So these ballot measures, I think, will give us a really good indication of how this is going to play out. And it gives a possible avenue, I think, for people who support access to abortion and abortion rights to think about the future. And so I think these really, hopefully, will kind of operate as test cases. Because in a lot of states, it's quite hard to get a ballot measure, a referendum on an issue like this. You have to get, generally it's a petition based, so you have to get a certain number of signatures, and there wasn't that much time before the deadlines, which is why we've only seen them in sort of those 5 states. I think if they're successful, or if they go well for the kind of pro-abortion groups, I think we'll see a lot more of them at the next presidential election in 2024, which has the potential to really shape how that election plays out as well. I think this issue has become so divisive and so visible in America that it's actually shaping their whole kind of political and electoral cycle. And so I think if we see some positive results from those 5 cases that are going to happen in November, you'll see this on the ballot in just about every state in 2024. And there'll be a massive push to get people registered, to get people out to vote, and to try and get some state level constitutional protection for abortion rights, which I think, being realistic, I think is the only way forward at this point in time. That conservative split on the Supreme Court is not going away. It's a 6-3 split at the moment. They're largely young. It's simply not going to change anytime soon, I don't think. So probably the best way forward is to kind of work at a state level. And whether that's, it's going to be different in every state. In some states, it will be simply a fight to get a 6-week or a 10-week law rather than a total ban. In some states, there will definitely be space to push for state constitutional protection for a much bigger right and a much stronger right. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of organizing and a lot of money, which presents a whole other series of challenges. But we're going to see kind of state Supreme Court decisions in a lot of these states. And it's going to create some kind of bureaucratic nightmares as well, which is part of the problem, I think, when you give an issue to 50 states to make different decisions on. It leads to a lot of inequality and different things like that. But yeah, that is kind of the formal part, I guess, of the talk. Hopefully that was interesting, and I'd love to kind of hear some questions and any feedback that any of you have.
Can I ask about just a little bit more detail about Kansas, because obviously both sides would have been campaigning very well. Was it a matter of money towards those campaigns, or what do you think made that difference?
I honestly, I think it's just a matter of that's where the public opinion probably already sat in Kansas. A lot of these states, I mean, the nationwide public opinion is obviously split kind of along those similar 60-40, maybe even 65-35 lines. But I think part of it is kind of some anger towards the Supreme Court for sort of I think people feel like they've overstepped their bounds and they see this as kind of nakedly political, right? It's not a legal decision. And I think it's always been the kind of opposition to abortion in the US from the Republican Party has always been a minority position. And the Republican Party is very good at making minority positions their platform and making people think that that's what they want, and so that's why they vote for them. When actually, when you break it down to the kind of individual issue, it's not the Republican Party is not really representative of the majority at all. So I think that the Kansas result just actually tells you that the people of Kansas, that's the way that they see things.
Kia ora, Hayden. Alison Green here. I lead a Kaupapa Māori's sexual health and research promotion organisation here in Aotearoa. Cool. And I want you to put on your crystal, or bring out the crystal ball, I guess. And what is the sort of cautionary tale for Aotearoa in terms of what's happened in the States?
I mean, I think part of it is it's a constitutional structure issue. So like I'm currently teaching a first year New Zealand politics course. And so these questions I think are really interesting. And I think it shows the benefits of our much more flexible constitutional structure, where in New Zealand, we're not kind of beholden to a Supreme Court made up of appointed, unelected old white men, which is what it has been for most of its history. And the fact that, we have a parliamentary sovereignty system means that the only way, something like this could happen in New Zealand would be if a majority of Parliament voted in that direction, which is much harder, I think, in a New Zealand context for that to happen. New Zealand has its own vulnerabilities, I think, with our kind of extreme parliamentary sovereignty. So there is a little bit of danger there, but I also think that we don't have the same particularly Christian conservatism that the US has. We obviously see some of it in the National Party, but nowhere near to the same extent that that kind of right-wing Christian conservative stuff has gripped the US. I guess the cautionary tale is to be wary and never take these things for granted. But I don't think we're, in my view, in any danger immediately of going down the same path. I think the situation is completely different in terms of kind of constitutional and judicial structures. It would take a very different set of circumstances here, I think.
Thank you.
We have a comment on the chat. Eliana says, an issue is the National Party passing laws under urgency. They did that a lot in previous terms.
Yeah, I mean, that's not just the National Party. The Labour Party are just as guilty of using urgency. It's a part of our parliamentary system, I guess, and you can pass laws, pretty quickly under urgency. But I think my sense is that the kind of public backlash that you'd get in New Zealand from doing that on an issue like this without having select committee hearings or something would just be so overwhelming that I don't think either of the major parties would ever go down that route. I think it would be effectively political suicide. Yeah.
Can I ask another question? How much control does one state have over another? And I'm thinking particularly of any restrictions that might be introduced regarding the medical abortion pills, for instance, being provided in one state and posted to another.
Yeah, so this is the can of worms that the Supreme Court's opened for itself, I think. And I think it's going to be the next thing that they'll have to confront. And there has been talk in a couple of particularly conservative states about things like regulating interstate travel when that travel is for the purpose of, accessing abortion care. The indications that I see, even from the Supreme Court, even as conservative as it is, the Constitution has really strong protection for the right to interstate travel. And so I think the current court makes it a little bit hard to predict with certainty, but my best guess is that I don't think that would pass muster. And that already is the way that people are getting around it. There's a lot of really great kind of on the ground charity work going on to get access, to give women access to abortion through travel to other states. I think some states are even funding it themselves through state budgets, which is fantastic. I know a lot of major corporations came out sort of pretty quickly and said, anyone who works for us, if you live in a state that has denied you that right, we'll pay for you to travel if you need to. There are obviously like privacy issues and stuff that come up there, and it's not a perfect solution. But I think that will always be an option at the moment. And there is talk, I was reading an article earlier today about the FDA is currently considering an over-the-counter early abortion pill. And so that will again raise another issue of, can you sell that in every state? Can you post it to your friend in another state if you buy it over the counter? So it opens up. I mean, this is going to be litigated left, right, and centre for the next 10 years, probably. It's problematic, but challenging.
We have another from the chat. This one's a question from Miranda Welsh. Can you explain that legislation from Montana, I think, about the born alive protections? Sorry, I may not have remembered your slide correctly.
Yes. So the Born Alive Act, I only briefly read up on this morning, but it's basically around at what point points of viability. And so it's kind of similar to an abortion ban at a particular date. It's just framed in a really weird way. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I think a whole lot of doctors are really concerned about it, particularly in cases where there's, a fetus with a particular defect or abnormality that means like it could be born alive, but it won't survive beyond 5 or 10 minutes. And those kind of really difficult situations that doctors face. So I think Montana also has some other quite stringent abortion protections from memory. So it's a weird one. I think it's the outlier in that group. Sorry, that's probably not a great explanation. Yeah.
And we have another question from Susan Crabtree. Are there also moves around embryo storage and destruction?
I think this is another thing that it's going to open up another debate. And it's going to force that debate into kind of a judicial space where it probably doesn't belong. It hasn't come up yet, as far as I'm aware. So it's another, I think, watch the space and see what happens. But yeah, it certainly complicates things in that regard as well.
That's all from the chat right now.
I'd like to just ask another question, perhaps not quite so relevant to your excellent talk, but my understanding is that in the States, abortion isn't a crime for any woman. And I gather that's pretty universal. It's the person who does the abortion that commits the crime. With regard to women's rights, is that correct? And do you see that being eroded at all?
This is where you hit real difficulties, because every state now has their own separate scheme with different penalties for different people in the process. A lot of states is focused on the doctors. I have a feeling, although I don't know for sure, that there are a couple of states that are going down the other route of criminalizing the woman themselves. I would have to go and do a little bit more digging into some of the kind of particular statutory schemes, but I think the decision in Dobbs definitely opens the door for that sort of criminalization if a state chose to pursue it. You certainly could. I don't think there's anything in the kind of constitutional law that remains after Dobbs that would stop you from doing that. And I think Alito's opinion is kind of particularly glaring for the fact that it nowhere mentions women's rights at all, which is really grim as an aside. But yeah, the focus is definitely on doctors and hospitals and other groups like that. But I could easily see that focus shifting onto women as well.
Actually, I can confirm that women have been prosecuted and are being prosecuted currently in the States for abortion-related activity. Yeah,
again, it's, I try and keep abreast of all these things, but I miss the odd thing, I guess. I know I did see a great case in Texas where, I think it was in Texas, there was a woman who was caught driving in a multi-person transit lane, and she challenged her police ticket, saying that, well, if you're going to consider my unborn child, a person under the law, then I actually had 2 people in my car, so you can't give me a ticket, which I thought was brilliant. And she won, which was great.
Any last?
Can I just chip in? I just want to say thanks very much, Hayden. I thought that was really, Ellen here, really interesting talk, and explained a whole lot of things that I hadn't really appreciated about the US system, but it is a worry for New Zealand in the future. So more of a comment and a question. So thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I just have one question. Obviously, I know your focus is more sort of the federal level, But I'm just wondering if I'm correct. I thought I read an article that when you talk about that kind of Republican project to stack the Supreme Court, that actually, and I think it was driven a lot by Mitch McConnell, his project has been to stack the states. And it's been a long kind of, no one really cared about the comptroller or whatever those other odd jobs, but they've been meticulously filling them with Republican roles. And so when stuff dropped down to the states, they're ready to kind of start ruling. Is that sort of something you...
Yeah, absolutely. So, and not just, packing state legislatures. So then you get into all of the controversies around gerrymandering, which is a whole talk in itself. A whole lot of state legislatures that are dominated by minority interests, driven by some kind of blatant politicking from the Republican Party, but also stacking state courts and stacking lower level federal courts. I think Trump in his term appointed more federal and state, well, more federal judges than any other president in history. And so you've got lower level federal and state courts stacked with Republicans as well, which, while it doesn't change the kind of final outcome of any Supreme Court decisions, it builds up a body of kind of, lower level precedent that can be quite influential on Supreme Court cases. But also remembering that, the Supreme Court only hears 110 cases a year. So the vast majority of cases are actually decided at those lower levels. And so, Mitch McConnell, I think, has a lot to answer for, in particular, one of my least favorite people.
It's also the Federalist Society that is, it's an organization just all Republican conservatives, and it's getting worse. I just listened to it's a podcast called Boom Lawyered, and it's two U.S. women. One is Black, and Imani Gandhi. She's amazing. So if you haven't heard it, it's called Boom Lawyered. But yeah, it's getting worse. Like, so this time, if you thought Dobbs and all of those were bad, it was the next ones up are there's a challenge about up at the Supreme Court to let state legislators, so each state gets to say, hey, we're going to make our own rules about voting and how to protect the vote or not protect the vote that isn't under the courts. Like that the courts can't interfere. And it's like,
the hearings on that started today, I think, or overnight our time. And it would, it potentially could completely undermine the Voting Rights Act. In terms of, public views, I think Dobbs will be the one that people think about, because it's kind of that emotional issue that people have a connection to. But the voting rights stuff that's being worked on at the moment could potentially be the most far-reaching and damaging thing. I don't have a great read on what way the court's going to go on that. I think a lot of that will depend on the leadership of Roberts. I think he will be very hesitant to overturn some of those key things, but because of the way that majority, there's 6 conservative justices, they don't need Roberts like they used to.
No.
But there are a couple, both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, neither of them have proven to be as conservative as predicted. And both of them have made a couple of quite surprising liberal-ish decisions. So I don't think it's necessarily a foregone conclusion, but I am worried for sure.
Yeah, because John Roberts, I didn't know this, but John Roberts is the Chief Justice. He was he's been against voting rights. He was one of the ones that gutted the voting rights currently, to say, before states had to ask permission to redraw maps, that would bar people for, people of color. And so, but I didn't realize that Chief Justice Roberts was back in the 80s against voting rights. That's been his goal. So I think he's going to have a lot of fun, unfortunately, with this one.
Roberts is an interesting one, because I think my read is that he's changed quite a lot in the last 5 years. And I think part of it's that he yeah, I think he has quite a deep care for the institution of the court and kind of preserving the integrity of the court. So in Dobbs, he didn't join the 5-person majority. He didn't dissent, but he would have kind of taken an intermediate step. I think his was based around like a 15-week limit. And he's done similar things in a couple of other cases where, you know, he was the kind of deciding vote that upheld the kind of key parts of Medicare as well. And I think he's probably more pragmatically aware of the fact that confidence in the court is kind of at an all-time low. And people see them as kind of nakedly political, and he actually cares about the institution and its kind of long-term development. So his vote is the one that I'm most interested to watch in those sorts of cases, because history kind of suggests that he'll go one way, but recent events maybe kind of suggest the other. And so it'll be interesting to watch. It was also great to see the latest new justice, Brown Jackson, in her first kind of hearings, taking a couple of them to task on her first day on the job a couple of days ago. She's fantastic.
She's amazing.
Yeah.
She was not like, you know, you would think like, oh, it's your first day on the job. You might, no, she was like, no. It's not how it is.
Watch that space. I think she could turn out to be a real kind of firecracker, which is, I think they need that.
Yeah.
Hayden.
Hello.
Hi. I'm part of the LRAN's exec committee, and I'm also the consumer representative for the New Zealand College of Sexual and Reproductive Health. And I'm also part of a worldwide support group ending unwanted pregnancy, and most of those members are actually from the States. I joined that group in 2016, and most of those people in the States will tell you that this is the biggest "we told you so" ever. And but what I want to say is that I've been really impressed how emboldened the people in that support group have now become to come out and tell their stories in the States, which is really brave over there, especially those who have had later gestation abortions. So I think you are going to see a real pushback. I mean, before the overturning, it was really rare that you would see any of those people in that support group willing to speak up and put their name, let alone their face, to anything to do with abortion. And I've been quite surprised by how many now are on TV ads, billboards, name, face, everything to protect and push back. So I found that really encouraging, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's why it's a depressing talk in some ways, but I was trying to make the point that it's not totally doom and gloom. It is a lot of doom and gloom, but there have been, seeing the reaction from the public, the shift in public opinion, the kind of outpouring of support, the mobilization of kind of ground level organizations, the fact that some states, even at state level, are providing funding for people out of state to travel, and it shows, I think, that there's kind of a little bit of hope left, and it also shows you, I think, how out of touch the Supreme Court is with the public. I think they've completely lost touch with that, which, if we look back at history, 150 years of Supreme Court history, they have occasionally got out of touch with public opinion. It doesn't happen that often, and it usually is followed by a correction. And so that's what I'm kind of hoping for. I don't think it will happen in the short term, but I think maybe medium term, some sort of correction, it's possible, right? The issue is not settled. Alito's opinion would have you believe that this is the last word on the matter, but it definitely is not.
I think what I find the most disheartening being part of that group is the women and families who say, you know, well, in my state, I can never try again now because my life was at risk, or I've got a genetic, you know, I might have this genetic issue again and I won't be able to receive abortion care. So I think it really brings home for me having friends over there who have had an abortion, and I found the distress quite distressing myself. I actually, the day it was overturned, I woke up and I had, you know, 50 or 60 messages, and I was like, oh my goodness, what's happened? And I really feel for them over there. I'm sure everyone does, but
it's I mean, the thing that I find particularly depressing is the fact that it sets up 50 different regimes, right? You know, there are some states where you have a particularly liberal access to abortion at any stage of pregnancy, and there are now some states where you have no access in any situation, like no exceptions. And to me, that's just a really, I mean, on one hand, it's a really daft way to run a country, right? To, you know, the total inequality that creates. And, you know, all the research shows that it'll have a disproportionate impact on people of color and people in situations of poverty. And, you know, the Supreme Court totally failed to engage with that either. And
it's nothing about healthcare. It's absolutely nothing about healthcare. And abortion is a healthcare issue. The decisions just make absolutely no sense for women's health.
Yeah, it's a political decision cast in legal terms, but it's you know, it's blatantly political to me. That's why they put those justices on the court, basically.
Well, Trump did.
Yeah, and some of his predecessors.
Yeah.
Both Bushes.
Hayden, any last comments? Perhaps your second most hated. No, we won't go there.
No.
Any last comments?
No, I don't think so. I've really enjoyed having this discussion. You know, being a historian of the Supreme Court, I don't often get to talk to people who care about what I have to say. So I am very grateful for all of you who've engaged with that conversation. And it's nice to know that, you know, there is some interest out there. And I've really enjoyed it. It's been fun. So thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I think you found a sort of group of geeks who are interested in this topic, and we really, really do appreciate the time and just the effort you put into just giving such a good talk. So thank you very much. And I did mention that there are some really good pieces that you've written in the press and stuff mostly, I think. So if people want to see more of Hayden's stuff, just Google his name and
Google me and you'll find it.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Cool, but otherwise we're on time. So thanks everyone for coming. We are going to confirm our next speaker for the next Kōrero, and we'll send that out via social media, so watch that space.
Awesome.
Thank you. Ka kite.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.